Welcome everyone to the Green Anti-Capitalist from Dash Lockdown, our regular show where we analyze the COVID-19 crisis from a green anti-capitalist perspective. This is our second episode, and we are going to be talking about what can social ecology reveal about the crisis. For that, we have a friend of GAF who has come here to talk a bit about the topic. His name is T. Um,
Hey,
yeah, we want to say hi to everyone.
uh, yeah, hi, I'm T. It's going to be a interesting hour or so, so let's see what we can make of it.
Yes, let's do this. So we're gonna have people on the call asking us questions, and also if you are on the chat live, I'll try to keep an eye on it. So if you do have questions, please let us know and all of that. But otherwise, we are just going to go ahead and start. So T, why don't you do you want to kind of start talking about the topic today?
Yeah, so I was going to start by just jumping off what we were doing last time. So, in the first live stream, we were looking at, or Jay was taking us through disaster capitalism. So, that was essentially that the pandemic is can be understood as a hazard, but it's not inherently a disaster.
Mm-hmm.
So the COVID-19 disaster that we're experiencing is essentially contingent on both the disease itself, but also on the failure of our social structure to respond effectively to it. So the disaster is the partial and sudden societal collapse that resulted, not just the disease and the death. Um, and I guess jumping off that, an alternate, better system can be envisioned that would not result in this disaster from this particular hazard. Um, so really, the disaster we're facing at the moment is a disaster of state capitalism of the system itself,
Mm-hmm.
not wholly um, the virus.
Right.
So so having understood the coronavirus crisis as a problem of capitalism, we can look at the origins of the pandemic itself and try to put it in context with the climate crisis,
Mm.
and by extension, capitalism. So we're going to be looking at the relationships between the pandemic, capitalism, and the climate crisis, and we'll use Bookchin's Social Ecology to help us.
Excellent. So maybe you want to start introducing book to yourself,
Yeah,
or
yeah.
is that
So um, he was born in 1921 in New York City. Um, his parents were Jewish Russian immigrants,
mm,
and his early days he spent sort of studying Marxism. He moved from Trotskyism, from Stalinism to Trotskyism in like the 30s,
mm,
and later to anarchism, which he settled on for most of his life. Um, that was until the late 80s. He became a lot more critical of anarchism, sort of calling it individualist. He uh, had a big problem with what he called lifestyle anarchism. Um, he officially broke from it in 1999 and uh, identified his own sort of new ideology that he called communalism, which was a form of libertarian socialism. So his ideas, I suppose he's most famous for his work on environmentalism through a libertarian socialist lens, and he's gone to be a major influence for um, probably most prominently Abdullah Öcalan and the whole Harpan Revolution.
yeah, which is still going on to this day.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Um, so uh, he's quite a sort of analytic philosopher,
Mm,
very much in the sort of um, Western tradition, sort of Enlightenment values kind of guy.
mm,
So depending on your perspective, that's either going to be uh, a good thing or a severe limitation. I would say it is a limitation, but uh, within that limitation, his theory, which can I guess, his theory is quite rich, but it's still, like I suppose all philosophies, it's incomplete.
Yeah, you have to understand that within its limitations and cannot take it as it is.
So yeah, the bulk of his thought, I guess, is can be termed social ecology, and in the sort of the one sentence summary of that is that all ecological problems are at their core social problems. They result from
fundamentally they are an extension of the structures of domination of
so the essentially the domination of nature stems from the domination of other humans. Our primary social ills and by extension ecological problems are a result of this system of hierarchy and the relations of domination therein. So he looks at humanity through an evolutionary lens. He sort of tracks these relations of domination through history and analyzes ecological problems sort of as arising from destructive and dominating human intervention in the natural world. So there's one thing we should clarify before we go on to his sort of dialectical naturalism, and that's a thing, sort of a note about human nature. So he is working off the understanding that human nature is not like a rigid set of behaviors like it's typically understood. So it's not that we're inherently competitive and hierarchy is natural. It's that there's essentially a spectrum of possible behaviors that are dependent on the material and social environment that the human subject is experiencing. So it's the idea of fixed human nature is typically used to justify capitalism, that it's the optimal solution for self-interested individuals. He's working off the assumption that human nature is more complicated than that, that what we understand human nature as can vary over time, and that there's no one behavior that's exhibited by all humans in all places at all times. So essentially, human nature is that we're very adaptable. So is there any questions so far? Check the chat.
Someone is saying that George Fox, who I don't know who it is quoted as saying, all models are wrong, but some are useful.
I like that line.
Yeah, that's a really good line. Which I think it references how Bookchin has some limitations, comes from a particular perspective and all that, but you can still find interesting things taking in mind those limitations.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess we'll go on to dialectical naturalism then.
Yeah, sounds wild.
The wild does come into it. So it's classic. So it's essentially a framework for understanding the unfolding of human history and how structured hierarchy has shaped it. It understands that society developed out of nature, and it looks at the social and natural and shows them sort of constantly interacting with each other, how they're dependent on each other, how they essentially constitute each other, and sort of it deals with the interdependence between the social and the natural world. So Bookchin starts by identifying first and second nature. So first nature is pretty much just what we see as nature. So it's the natural and biological world, the non-social world. It's what he's specifically referring to is essentially the totality of relations between all non-human animals and plants. Like it's ever-changing, it's constantly evolving. It's it's a system of flux. It's sort of it's very, very, very diverse, very, very complicated, and all incredibly interrelated. So he distinguishes that from something he terms second nature, which is a little more complicated, complicated in an understanding sense. So second nature emerged from first nature, and it retains some of the sort of it retains a lot of the characteristics of it, but it's not wholly the same. So it's
is it referring to kind of the human aspects of that emerges from nature, or
I mean, Bookchin termed it institutionalized community. It's essentially referring to how certain aspects of being human, so our cognitive faculties, opposable thumbs, I suppose, have allowed us to create our own social world, our own environment. And that human community is, he argues it's distinct from the non-human ones in a number of ways. So non-humans form communities, but they do so sort of, well, at least he argues they do so naturally and instinctively. Whereas for us, we institutionalize, it's internally organized, it's structured developmentally. It's, I think, so an ant colony, for example, an ant colony doesn't have any rules, it doesn't have any customs, it doesn't have institutions, but it's still a community. It's still there's still a totality arising from the individual constituent parts. It's just not a conscious effort,
right?
Whereas a human society, it's quite different to that. So
is it like secure nature societies are kind of self-aware among themselves, kind of like they construct themselves being aware that they're
I don't know if the individuals in society need to be necessarily self-aware of what they're doing. It's more just that it's specifically human. So it's just not acting wholly on intuition and what comes naturally. It's something more structured than that. It essentially, it's
born out of the kind of human capacities.
Yeah, it's set rules, it's intentionality, it's a structure that lasts from one generation to the next. It's I guess it's sort of organized and rigid rather than sort of
wild.
Yeah, I suppose, yeah. So the hierarchical relations that we briefly touched on earlier when we were talking about human nature, those hierarchies that people that often view a fixed human nature of competition, what was it? the hierarchy that emerges is it's a socially constructed human hierarchy.
Right.
To say that it just naturally emerged is it's a misunderstanding, essentially, because relations in nature are sort of inherently not hierarchical. Like even a sort of a predator-prey relationship, there's no real hierarchy there. That's just that's us projecting our understanding of hierarchy onto what is a naturally occurring event. There's no system that determines that one animal is prey and one is predator. There's no it wasn't forethought like years and years and years before that the leopard is going to eat the antelope. The leopard just is hungry, so goes for the antelope.
Right.
It's not a structured system, so it's not really a hierarchy. A hierarchy is a social structure.
Right.
So the idea that we're naturally inclined towards hierarchy because of our competitive nature, even if we had a competitive nature, that would kind of be bullshit. But it's especially so because, you know, just because we would have a behavior in some way, it doesn't necessarily imply that we need to have a social structure that there isn't necessarily a specific social structure that corresponds to a specific set of behaviors.
Right. Yeah. Just because even if there was some kind of natural preference towards certain behaviors, doesn't mean that we have, like, you know, these social structures, the institutions kind of like reinforcing those behaviors and reinforcing those conducts and kind of enabling that form of oppression.
Yeah,
that's all part of that second nature. That's all part of like.
Yeah, well, this idea, this tactic, has been used by like elites throughout history to justify their oppression. Like the idea of just obfuscating relations of oppression by saying that it's natural. It's just this is just how things are. That's been used. It's still used today, and it's been used for thousands of years, and it'll be used for a while yet.
Yeah, and also how they are saying in this chat, thinking of hierarchies as natural overlooks mutualistic and symbiotic relationships within nature, which is kind of like the Kropotkin argument of, you know, mutual aid as a factor of evolution, which I believe Bookchin is very influenced as well by that kind of line of thought.
Most likely, yeah. Yeah, I haven't looked into specifically the relationship between Kropotkin and Bookchin, but yeah. So I mean, yeah, like anthropological evidence kind of shows this as well. Like what you were just saying, there's empathy and cooperation have cropped up throughout all of human history. The sort of still dominant Hobbesian understanding of like human nature and sort of what was he said, like a war of all man against all man. Life is, you know, nasty, poor, brutish, and short, or whatever. Like
man
that's
is a wolf for man. That kind of stuff.
It's pretty much unsubstantiated by anthropology. So, so should we check the chat?
I think, yeah, the chat is doing okay. Unless anyone has any questions or any contributions.
Just before we go on to sort of before we go on to the next bit, I guess.
I think they're good. If not, they can let us know. The other was, I think we can go on.
Okay. The central argument, I guess, is that our view of nature is a reflection of our society and the totality of our social relations that are experienced. So, as social relations change throughout history, so does our view of nature. And Bookchin tries to demonstrate this by looking at how nature was understood at various times in history. So in, you know, thousands of years ago in so-called primitive cultures, humans were much closer to nature. They typically viewed everything as having a soul. and sort of the idea of a sort of global community was kind of integral to the worldview.
In what sense?
In the sense that there was the distinct, I guess, but in Bookchin terms, it would be the distinction between first and second nature was much more ambiguous. So it would be that almost like sort of a oneness with the earth, I guess.
Sure, that people didn't see themselves as a separate entity from
yeah,
the natural world and nature.
Yeah. That came along a little bit later. So if we jump to like sort of the ancient societies, like the Greeks, for example, so they viewed distinctions and dichotomies a lot in the world. So so the first and second nature had sort of converged at this point. There was much more obvious difference between what was natural and what was human. So there was, you had nature as sort of wild and humans as doing cultivation. And you had sort of there's sort of an order and chaos sort of dichotomy where humans are order and nature is sort of chaotic and ununderstandable. And this was essentially a lot of the views at the time was through the lens of dichotomies. So you had sort of or dual, I think dualism, yeah, simple dualisms. So like slave master,
right?
And this idea was projected onto nature as well. And then later in the medieval world, when this dualism was expanded to sort of a much more, there was a much more hierarchical understanding of nature. So you had the animal kingdom, where it was literally believed that lions were at the top, and because they were like royalty, and lowly ants were at the bottom because they were like serfs. And it sounds kind of ridiculous now, but it was what was believed at the time. So as essentially as hierarchies became sort of much more rigid and entrenched, when we get to sort of the 1500s, 1600s, people externalizing their social relations onto their understanding of nature. So today we're at the point of state capitalism. So we've had the sort of mechanization of exploitation, which has led to the sort of breakdown of communities, like atomization and individualization since the 80s, Thatcherism really, and we see each person, society is sort of only looking out for themselves. They're supposedly sort of supposedly free, but and can sort of do what they want, but only the strongest or the most competitive will survive. And this sort of looks very similar to our understanding of nature as sort of competition between individual creatures, and survival of the fittest, natural selection, that sort of thing.
Right.
Sort of reductionist Darwinism, I guess.
Yeah, which is not necessarily what science and scientists actually say. Is a very selective understanding of it based on what we want to project onto it.
Certainly what scientists believed at one point, and probably still what quite a few would believe today. But that's going into more complicated territory.
Sure.
scientists are not immune to ideology.
Yeah.
So we have this sort of image of nature as competition between individuals, when actually a lot of what we understand, a lot of contemporary understanding is sort of pushing away from that.
Yeah.
So there was, I remember reading something recently about even looking at trees. You can't really see trees as just individuals. It's more because they're all sort of connected underneath and dependent on each other. It just doesn't really make sense to see them that way. But for so long, we've been sort of projecting individuality on them. So what Bookchin's essentially trying to show here is that there's no objective way to study the natural world that is independent of our human interpretation and our lived experience. And all that itself is dependent on our social context. So we've had a great deal of commodification and sort of quantification of our whole social environment over the last 40 years. And when we view nature through that lens, what it becomes is something external to us to be controlled rather than a part of us. So sort of, our experience and our interaction with each other shapes our worldview and our behavior, and it shapes our motivations. So when we live in a society where sort of domination and hierarchy and oppression are a sort of norm, and exploitation is the primary motor for social reproduction, is it really a surprise that our attitude towards nature reflects that? Like, we sort of see it as, well, as commodities and resources to be extracted and something to be transformed and controlled and exploited and manipulated. It's not, it's not something else. It's that.
Yeah.
So
yeah, so does anyone has any questions so far? Maybe in the chat. I think this is kind of like the main point where we start to see how capitalism and the state and all these structures kind of interact with nature and shape the way humans interact with nature, which I guess is where we go now to talk about how that has led to the circumstances that made the coronavirus hazard into a crisis.
Yeah, we can go on to that. Well, I guess a lot of so a number of scientists recently have been identifying the cause of the coronavirus as a loss of biodiversity. So the crisis of the loss of biodiversity is known as, in scientific circles, as biological annihilation, which
nice.
Yeah, it does not sound fun.
No.
And it's not. So I think there was a recent report that said that 60% of mammals, reptiles, birds, and fish have died since the 70s.
Yes, some people are calling it like a new mass extinction.
Yeah.
Although there's some debate about the term, some people are calling like our current time as the Anthropocene, because they argue that we have such a massive impact in nature that we have fundamentally changed it. Although there's some discussion if that's the right name, because it kind of puts the blame on everyone equally, and it shouldn't be. Maybe should be put on capitalism and all like that. But it's that idea that the impact of human activity on nature has been just incredibly extensive and in a lot of ways damaging.
Yeah. So yeah, I think so recently it was the 24th of March, there was a bunch of wildlife and environmental organizations sent a letter to the US Congress basically saying that identifying the cause of this pandemic as the biological annihilation, which is species extinctions, die-offs, and massacres, I think. And it's seen as it's largely been seen as the root cause of the problem. And it can be, through social ecology, we can see that the loss of biodiversity is itself directly a result of capitalism. So you've got the trade of wildlife in the wet markets in Wuhan was the sort of perfect breeding ground for a virus to, not breeding ground, the perfect place for zoonotic spillover, which is where viruses come from, I guess, first nature to humans. And there's also habitat destruction.
Right.
So logging and drilling and agriculture and resource extraction and everything like that just ravages the natural world and sort of not just destroys large numbers of, physical bodies, but also concentrates living things closer together, including animals and humans, which is again massively increasing the chances of viruses from spreading, from coming over. So unfortunately, this pandemic may not be a one-off. It's actually just part of a long trend that has been sort of accelerating recently of sort of zoonotic diseases coming into contact with humans and just spreading. We had SARS and swine flu and bird flu and that sort of stuff. So, and that trend will continue to worsen as the climate breakdown worsens. So, yeah. Is there anything in the chat yet?
No.
So it's not all. We can go on to the next part of the stuff now if we want.
Yeah, I don't know if people have in mind other ways in which capitalism has kind of created, not capitalism, but or social structures of domination has created this lack of biodiversity and this destruction of nature that has enabled the virus to have this massive effect on the human species. I don't know if people in the chat has any ideas of that or want to comment anything. But if not, we can move to a bit of the more positive side of the talk.
More positive, yeah.
Sure.
So we've essentially seen how our social ideology affects our social behavior, and that in turn can result in pretty devastating things on the material world. So there's no reason to divide up the land into property or hoard natural resources outside of the social relations of power that developed prior to that happening. So while Bookchin's philosophy will seek to abolish these sort of established oppressive social hierarchies, and that includes not just capitalism, but the state and white supremacy and patriarchy and all the other ones.
All the fun ones.
Yeah. It also, he provides sort of reconstructive ideas of what a better society would look like. So essentially, since the ecological crisis stems from social relations, changing our social relations can provide a solution. He proposes it goes by a few different names: democratic confederalism, libertarian municipalism. Some people just call it communalism. But whatever we call it, it's so he outlines a society that's a sort of rational, ethical, and liberatory society. So what that would mean is decentralized, bottom-up, directly democratic network of communities. It's not that dissimilar from typical understandings of anarchist or communist societies. What's different is sort of how it comes about. Right. So he envisions essentially the emergence of the new society from within and without state capitalism, sort of cooperative social structures effectively being secreted at a community level, sort of gradually developing in scope and power, and to the point where they can sort of challenge or supersede the state.
So is this like the idea of dual power structures, or what some people
he
talk?
He did talk about dual power, yeah. I don't necessarily buy that idea, but yeah. Yeah. And he also identified a third type of nature that would correspond with this society, called free nature. And this is, in a way, his dialectical synthesis, except where sort of Hegel and Marx had a sort of termination point and end point in history. Bookchin doesn't go with that. He's sort of talks about a sort of ever expanding self-understanding. Sort of, I think this is where the term unity of diversity comes in. Right. Sort of much sort of ever growing richness in subjectivity. I don't know how else to describe it, really. Yeah, it's a bit. Yes, that one's a bit more complicated. Yeah. So he defined it as nature rendered self-conscious in a rational and ecological society. So free nature is not just a material society or just a worldview. It's kind of both of these things. It's a social structure and a corresponding ideology that guides or facilitates or motivates us to sort of behave responsibly and ecologically, I guess, as if it's human nature, sort of like how our society motivates us to be competitive as if it's our social nature. Even though it isn't actually our human nature. So the dichotomy between sort of humans and nature is resolved in this. It's sort of the sort of fundamental interconnectedness of first and second nature is understood, and yeah, the sort of the ideological distinction between the two is essentially recognized as transient. So yeah, basically he would argue that the problem isn't humans, it's not human nature. The problem isn't just the pandemic, it's the particular setup of our society, and that society is one that places profit, so competition, endless growth, exploitation above everything else. I think is that more or less the end of the official talk? That's the end of everything I had notes on. Nice. I think that's very good. Thanks a lot. We could probably do some questions if there's any in the chat. Yeah, so if people have any questions so far about the whole talk,
this will be a great time to do it. I do see someone with a hand raised. I don't want to say the name, but I assume you're fine with me saying it. But yeah, Hamish, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, please go ahead.
Hi everyone. Yeah, no, don't worry about not saying my name. It's not a problem for me. Yeah, I thought it was interesting some of the things you said. I'm not really familiar with Bookchin. I mean, I've heard of him. I've read a couple of bits. Like, I kind of understand that it originally came from a sort of anarchist background. Seems to, yeah, I've got a very vague understanding that he's sort of gone more of a sort of socialist direction. I just wanted to bring in a couple of things that I've been thinking about a lot recently, and that I'm trying to communicate to people and kind of sort of spread the word about, really, in many ways. The first thing I'd sort of mention about that is the idea of what Michael Albert says about things in terms of the ideas around what he describes as being paricon or parsoc or participatory society, which is kind of like has a lot of elements of anarchism in it, but also socialism. But I've been listening to his podcast recently. I've listened to all of them now, and some of them, a lot of them are really, really good. Some of them are a bit on the dull side, but a lot of them are really good. And I highly recommend listening to them. I can put a link in the chat shortly about that if anyone's interested. I'll just lower my hand so you don't keep thinking I'm wanting to speak. Down the hand. Right. Okay. So the reason I bring it up is because he talks a lot about vision and strategy. And I also do quite a lot of stuff with Extinction Rebellion and a few other groups. And he talks about the idea of the necessity to have a clear vision that people can kind of find inspirational, to be able to imagine, to be able to think, right, well, that's something I really want to strive towards, rather than the sort of, as he describes it, this kind of constant sort of an ongoing analysis that people in groups like this and other groups that I do with stuff with, and that you see all over the internet and so on, and in general discourse, always going, oh, that thing's really bad, and this is why it's bad, and that's why it's bad, and if we only had this, if we only had that, but without a kind of coherent, kind of really easily communicated inspirational vision of where you're trying to get to, and also laying out kind of a strategy of how to get there. What I'm curious about is how what you're talking about with Bookchin, how that fits in with that. But I'm also really interested in the idea of a great range of groups coming together to sort of be able to, in some way, find some sort of common ground and say, look, this is a vision that we would all get behind. This is something we could promote as a common kind of sort of a way forward to a new world that we could mobilize people around. And the reason I'm mentioning all this now, this is sort of a bit of a long ramble, is, as we all know, there's this huge crisis that far outshadows the terrible COVID crisis we're already in, which is the breakneck speed climate and ecological breakdown that's coming our way, and that's already, obviously, people are already suffering with that and have for a long time already, and obviously the sixth mass extinction is already in place and it's already ongoing. Obviously, at this point, not disaster levels, but it's going to be there in the not too distant future. And it just seems obvious and I would have thought everyone here would agree that we need massive change, profound change, and it's going to happen really rapidly as well. So it seems to me like that there's a really important task ahead for us, where is how do we create this mass movement that can get this profound change on such an urgent timescale. And it seems to me the only way to do that is if we're able to unite in some way and collaborate in a broad collaboration internationally, and create this international mass movement. And I'm curious what the speakers that we've heard so far would say to that, and how they would look at the way what you've been saying about Bookchin and the ideas around that and social ecology and so on, how that all fits in. So yeah, that was a lot. I've not really asked a specific question there, but I just wanted to contribute that. I hope that it's some interesting things to talk about.
Thanks a lot. Do you have anything to say? If not,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So I definitely agree that we need a sort of global movement where we all cooperate and share a somewhat unified purpose. But I think there's a danger with trying to find a sort of a single unifying goal or a single sort of vision of what we want, especially because we can be wrong, and we have been in the past, because what we want out of the movement is going to depend on where we are and what we're experiencing. So if we look at in the 20th century, you had a lot of revolutionary movements that went about it by just reflecting the state structures, and they ended up just becoming, well, a lot of them anyway became pretty authoritarian because they ended up replicating what they knew, replicating where they came from. So I think there's a danger with trying to blueprint and map out exactly what we want a future society to look like, because we're not in that society now. We don't know what it's going to look like.
Yeah, and I think another aspect is also that what our desired society may look like for people in one context is not going to be the same in other places. Maybe something even more interesting that Bookchin is there's the ideas of Ocalan and Democratic Confederation in Rojava, because they do talk about having a kind of like a vision, a system, a method to achieve it in mind, but they do say this is what we have come up for our context, and we want other people to do the same process, but that doesn't mean that they come up with the same solutions. And every place is different. It comes from different. It has many different backgrounds. It has many different histories, like the things that the societies and the structures that the indigenous people in South America or Central America, and that they come up with kind of like as an alternative to capitalism and the state. They come from a particular understanding of their culture that is not going to be the same for everyone, and one to then supersede the other necessarily.
Well, that's kind of why I think Bookchin's democratic nationalism is at least somewhat useful, because it can sort of it's compatible with an understanding of it as more like a set of guidelines and principles for how we go about getting to a point where we can have a society that is self-defined. So not placing a certain understanding of justice as central, or a certain understanding of equality as central. It can be sort of a method for a society coming about at a local level that can then be or can really be I'm looking for the word, I can't quite get it off my mind, but sort of actualized through our behavior as we want to, as sort of as events unfold.
Right, I can adapt.
Maybe I didn't explain that too well.
Yeah.
But
also I think another important aspect is that it's important to have that vision. I think it's important to people to kind of like have a vision of the future they want, but it's also for me really important not only to have that vision but to show it in practice. Like that's why I find it useful many of the ideas we talk about, and it's because they do work in practice in the context of our current times. So we are seeing a lot of this with the emergence of mutual aid groups, which is putting into practice a lot of the ideas that we have in the libertarian left and stuff like that. and is a way not to kind of like reaching out to people and showing them that these things are not just for a utopian future 50, 100 years from now, but that it actually improve their lives
Here in the now.
here and now. Yeah. So that vision of utopia doesn't have to be a vision for the future. It has to be a vision for right now, for your neighborhood, for the people you talk with every day. I think that's something really important, that we idealized visions doesn't have to be for a future that we cannot attain right now. We can create those visions, visions that are actually achievable right now.
Should we?
Maybe. But yeah, it's an interesting topic, and Parecon is something I look into, and it really has some interesting ideas as well. So I definitely recommend people to look into it as well. I think we had.
Are we going to someone else now?
Yeah, if we have someone else, we do have a question in the chat, which was saying, can you go over the bit about the roles of hierarchy in nature? There was something you were not. It was something you were not.
The roles of hierarchy in nature. I'm not sure I understand that.
I think it was talking about maybe when you talk about the role of predators and prey, how there wasn't necessarily a hierarchy. I think.
Okay, I guess because a hierarchy is or at least myself and Bookchin would I think I'm coming from the understanding that a hierarchy is a social relation that's resultant from a structure in society,
right?
And because there are no structured societies in the formal sense outside of humanity, there's no hierarchy.
Right.
It's not like the leopard is going for the antelope because he's or she is allowed to, or because the leopard is dominating the antelope in any way.
Yeah,
it's just an instinctive sort of it's just an instinctive necessity, really.
Right, like just because an animal is faster than the other doesn't mean that's a structure of domination and power that has been reproduced through culture and history and all these things that is actually allowing this animal to dominate over the other, and justifying that domination, all these things that we see with capitalism, the state, and all this. So
like there's no council of leopards that gave permission to this leopard to eat the antelope,
right?
Or even a council of nature that gave permission to leopards broadly to eat antelopes.
Yeah, there's no leopard police that is making sure that if the antelope tries to fight back, they get beaten down,
exactly.
to jail, all these things. Yeah. We also had another hand raised from Cascadian Liberation. So if you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Justin. I'm from Seattle, Washington.
Hey.
And I would consider myself to be a libertarian municipalist. And kind of speaking to that previous question about like what does a utopian society look like? And I feel like from like a Bookchin like municipalist program, it's more about like creating like popular assemblies, neighborhood assemblies, this areas for direct democracy where people that are affected by the decision in a locality can make the decisions democratically together, which is really hard for a lot of us. Like there's a lot of that vanguardist approach of like we have all of the answers and then we want to like kind of convince everybody, whereas like this approach is like trusting that people in neighborhoods around like some certain like general principles can come together and make the correct decisions for themselves, and then like confederating those assemblies so that way there's like a broader like intercommunalism and like accountability and mutual aid between like different regions. So yeah, I think it's hard for people to grasp because they want like the one program or the 12-point program where it's more about like putting it back onto the people, the polis, to kind of like decide for themselves.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point.
Yeah, completely agree.
And I believe also Bookchin kind of talks about this idea of that there's systems, kind of like democratic structures and communities that still kind of survive the individualization and atomization of capitalism. So in every society that'll look different, and they'll have like a different context and conditions, but that we should kind of try to look for them and start working from them. Which is again talks about the locality of all of this and how it is depending on the specific context.
Yeah.
Let's see. Hold on. Let's go. Should we go for another maybe 10 minutes, then 15 minutes?
Yeah, I can go on longer. Yeah.
So we have Hamish. If you want to come back again briefly.
Sorry about that. I just wanted to emphasise that when I was talking about a vision of a future vision, if you do look at the links I sent there, it's very much on the in a similar area, similar kind of approach to what you've been describing, the idea of the councils and so on, the self-organising. It's not prescriptive. It's about self-management. It's about equity, sustainability, and so on. It's not about saying we need to have a certain tax regime or necessarily redistribution, but it does obviously address the private property issues and the class domination issues and so on. I'd really recommend it. I just wanted to clarify that my vision isn't something like saying, we need to have this institution, that institution, and another institution. It's more about a kind of a program of as people have been saying, about creating a new genuine democracy and a genuine self-management into the society. I just wanted to just emphasise that, really. But, it's been lovely to speak to you all.
Yeah, thank you. Also in the chat, someone is recommending an excellent book that I'm familiar with, which is Making Rojava Green Again, which is produced by Dog Press, maybe. Anyway, I may be getting that wrong, but yeah, it's an excellent book. I have it in my hands, and it's really, really nice. And the graphic design as well is amazing. Anyway, but yeah, they were recommending as a great introduction to the kind of the ideas behind the Rojavan Revolution.
Yeah, I could probably recommend another book that I used for the research for this live stream. It's called Bookchin, A Critical Appraisal by Damien F. White. We've got it right here.
Yeah, but for the people who cannot see it.
Yeah, it's a great little book. Sort of goes through sort of the main bulk of Bookchin's theory and sort of just condenses it into something that's actually quite readable, because going through the entire life's work of Bookchin is quite a task.
Yeah, sure. And I also found it, I was also reading it a bit, and I found it really interesting that it was also very critical of Bookchin. I think that's a good sign. And and some of the things you were talking at first of the fact that he has a very Western point of view,
Western-centric,
West-centric, that and it talks about those limitations and the possible failures, and talks about the recent historiography and anthropology and how it compares to what our books was saying. So yeah, if you want to get a pretty reasonable deep understanding of Bookchin as well as his limitations, it's a really good book. Let me see. I have another raised hand here from Guy. So go ahead.
Hi there. Can you hear me? Is that all right?
Yes.
Yep. Yeah. Cool. So I was just quite interested in what you were saying about the way that we view wildlife as a projection of sort of our society as a whole. And I was just wondering if you have a perspective, or if social ecology offers a perspective of the way in which we kind of dominate nature and sort of domesticize it, and try and the way we turn wildlife into farm life, and the destructive sort of way that we go about that, and whether social ecology sort of presents an option how that might change in the future as our social structure changes. Thanks.
Yes. So I suppose.
Yeah, this will be basically how do we treat the cows after the revolution?
Yeah. So I guess like instead of like doing monocropping, for example, we could transition to much more sustainable forms of agriculture, like veganic farming, for example.
Yeah, ideas of permaculture as well.
Yeah, yeah. Sort of even directly utilizing technology to sort of protect ecosystems and expand biodiversity is a sort of to sort of make up for the damage we've done already.
Yeah. That's maybe, if I know correct, if I'm not wrong, an interesting point about Bookchin is that he is not the kind of like green. He doesn't go for the view of like, we have to abandon technology.
Oh yeah, absolutely not.
He has a more positive view of technology in that he thinks it could be used, have a positive effect on our relationship with nature. Which is in opposition to.
He's not an Amprim.
Yeah, he's not an Amprim, and that can be argued, but it's definitely part of his vision. So he doesn't seem like necessarily a return to pastoral like society, everyone either hunting and gathering and but using kind of like the accumulated developments of technology to put them
yeah. So I'm trying to think of a few examples then of sort of things. So we've got the scale down of the meat industry, pretty much. Sort of idea of spending, using most of our land to grow grains to feed animals that we then eat, which is like an incredible waste of resources, like water, land, particularly. It's just devastating. It's a huge amount of. It's something like, I'm pretty sure it's like half the land in the US is used to grow food for animals to eat, and then we only get like a tiny fraction of the calories from the animal that we would have got if we'd just grown crops that we could eat in the first place. I guess on the side of cities, there's been, so Bookchin did a lot of work on urbanization and the sort of cities, I guess. And I think one way we could see that sort of emerge in the future, if we had this sort of Bookchinite utopia, is sort of sustainable cities. So the idea of like in is it Singapore, where you've got the building, the big tall white buildings with like trees spiraling up the structure of the building?
Sure, I've also heard about Cuba doing stuff like this.
Okay, well, you can have this sort of buildings that are like skyscrapers that are sort of shaped in sort of weird blocky fashion, that allows space for trees to be planted in sort of gardens that go all the way around the outside of it. And you can fit 40 times more trees on a skyscraper because of the verticality than if you just had a flat piece of land. So you can actually get like carbon positive buildings. That's I think something that's would definitely get a lot of Bookchinites excited.
Cascadian Liberation wanted to come again, say something, I think.
Oh, I think I just forgot to unraise my hand. Sorry, guys.
No worries.
No problem. But yeah, I don't think we have any more questions on the chat or anything like that. Let me see if I don't. But yeah, I'll try to. If you share any links on the chat, because I'm seeing someone kind of a bit worried about losing all the links. I will propose people share them as well on the Facebook event for this talk, and that way everyone who came here can see them and we can see them as well. and I try to anyway share everything. But yeah, maybe do we want to go for wrapping thoughts? But yeah, what would be your critical appraisal of Bookchin's perspective, completely off the script?
I appreciate a lot of Bookchin's work, but I mean I don't take any theorist to be wholly right.
Right.
So I including myself.
Sure.
So I don't. Yeah, I guess I draw from his works, but I wouldn't say he's the be all end all of things. You know, I don't think dialectical naturalism has the scope to sort of
explain everything, or
well, I don't think any theory can explain everything,
sure.
But I don't know. I hadn't really thought of final thoughts, I guess.
Sure. No, I think the ideas of Bookchin are really it kind of like draws a lot of attention to to this kind of like two different aspects of our society, which is or systems of domination and structures of power, and then the kind of the climate, the nature and the conditions of the climate and all these things that don't seem to be seen as related fundamentally. They kind of like people tend to see it like very separately, like climate change is
sort of happening over there while we're doing something.
Yes, that's
here.
the thing. Yeah, like
whereas,
it's happening in nature, which somehow is separated from us. It's just we have to go and fix down the old nature somehow. Like it is your old table or something. And instead of seeing like a extremely interrelated with humanity, and especially with the structures of domination of humanity, and understanding that relationship. Can like help us, in my opinion, can help us really understand why we need to not just like concern ourselves with things like climate change, but at the same time concern ourselves with the issues of democracy, socialism, and all these ideas, because they are interrelated and they cannot be separated. So you can so you cannot have you cannot continue having a capitalist status white supremacy society that's unexpected, that somehow that's going to make can be have a positive impact on the climate.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think we're going to leave it there for now. Thank you to everyone who came to the chat, who was listening on Twitch, and if you are listening to us in the future on YouTube or wherever, feel free to check out all the previous episodes, which so far is only one, and also all the things that the Green Anti-Capitalist Front is up to. We have very soon the upcoming May Day Revolt, which is kind of like an open call to all groups and individuals to take autonomous actions to attack and expose capitalism, the state, white supremacy, and all the systems of domination in whatever way they think are most appropriate. But, it can be both.
We're not specifying anything.
Yes,
here.
We are not specifying anything. We are not giving specific structures. This is very important that we clarify it. But it can go from somewhere as simple as engaging in your mutual groups, putting out posters, stencils, banner drops, to other more
let's say extra legal.
Yeah, extra legal stuff, which of course we will never encourage directly.
Never.
But yeah, anyway, that's coming for the 1st of May. And we also have very important, we are going to have a reading group happening in 1 week that is going to go over some text that also talk about Bookchin's ideas on social ecology. You don't have to have read all of them, but of course it will help. And if you have listened to this talk, you'll have a really good understanding. So and even if you're just curious, like just come and just have an opportunity to discuss all these ideas more openly and more thoroughly. So check that out as well on our social media, and follow us on all Facebook, Twitter, Mastodon. Apparently,
We have a Mastodon.
I don't know. I think and Instagram. I think
we do have an Instagram.
Yes.
At least GAF has an Instagram. I don't know
yeah.
if GAF
So
London does.
follow us on all these things, and and keep an eye on all and everything coming up. We have a lot of ideas and projects coming up, so keep an eye on it. And with that said, I think we're going to say goodbye for today. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
And as always, death to capitalism, death to white supremacy. Keep safe.
Yeah.
See you soon.